Alaska is recognized.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I want to commend my colleague from Oregon and his comments. And as a matter of fact, I don't disagree with pretty much anything he said. I had my first good meeting with Mr. Sams this morning, and I would agree. I think he's qualified. I'm particularly impressed with his background as a Native American, as a veteran. One thing I like to talk a lot about is how our Alaska Native populations, our Native American populations, serve at higher rates in the military than any other ethnic group in the country. Special patriotism. Mr. Sams certainly carries that tradition on quite well. And I have already talked to Senator Wyden. I intend to work with him and Mr. Sams just on a few more issues, a few more discussions. Again, we had a very good conversation this morning. This is nothing about his qualifications, but I wanted to make sure the administration is aware of some issues at very high levels as it relates to this position, this job. And again, I agree with my colleague from Oregon. This is an extraordinarily important federal agency. As a matter of fact, it's so important for my state that I want to explain a little bit to my colleagues, many of whom don't really know what the National Park Service does. But to my state, it's enormously important, it's powerful, and it can it can touch on people's lives in huge ways. Let me just give you a little bit of the numbers, Mr. President. The federal government manages roughly 66% of the lands in Alaska. Of that, the Park Service controls 55 million acres. 2/3 of all National Park Service land, 2/3 of the land that Mr. Sams will be in charge of are in my state. A lot of people don't recognize that. A lot of people don't understand that. Alaskans understand it. 2/3. So he is one of the big, important landlords of the great state of Alaska. And as you can imagine, this agency has outsized influence in Alaska beyond what these numbers represent. For hunting, for fishing, for transportation, for culture, and for people's livelihoods. And Mr. President, this has been an agency, to be quite frank, that has been abusing its power in Alaska for decades. Democrat administrations and Republican administrations. In 1980, this body passed the Alaskan National Interest Lands Conservation Act, what we call in Alaska ANILCA. The Congress took 100 million acres of Alaska lands. We weren't supportive, by the way, in Alaska. 100 million acres. That's bigger than almost any state represented in the U.S. Senate. Bigger than 2 Minnesotas. And a huge part of ANILCA laid out how the National Park Service would interact with Alaskans. For decades, Alaskans were saying that the way in which the National Park Service was treating Alaskans, by the way, Alaska Natives in particular, was not according to the law, was not according to ANILCA. And Mr. President, it wasn't just Alaskans saying this. In the last 4 years, there have been 2 United States Supreme Court decisions. They're referred to as the Sturgeon decisions, where an Alaskan who wanted to go hunting sued the National Park Service, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, twice in the last 4 years, 9-0, agreed with Alaskans that the National Park Service was not following the law as it related to ANILCA. As Justice Kagan, who wrote one of the opinions, said, Alaska is often the exception, not the rule, to issues relating to federal lands and access. Now, as you can imagine, the National Park Service did not like getting slammed by the U.S. Supreme Court twice, 9-0. But we liked it. It was a vindication of what Alaskans for decades have been saying about the abuse of power of the National Park Service. So I want to work with Senator Wyden and Mr. Sams on further conversations soon. We're not trying to block this. I know the National Park Service needs leadership, and I think he would be a good leader, but to look at making sure the implementation of these two U.S. Supreme Court decisions, 9-0, are followed through by the entire bureaucracy. It's not much to ask. These are topics I raised with Mr. Sams today. He seemed to be in agreement with me, but these issues are enormously important to the people I represent. And Mr. President, I'm going to mention one final thing, and it's not really in Mr. Sams' area of expertise, but I mention this to him as well. All Americans have been experiencing economic, pandemic-related pain over the last 20 months. My state, I think, has been as hit hard as any other state, particularly on the economic side. And I want to just raise this topic right now because I'm going to come down the Senate floor and talk about it a lot more here. But it relates to some of these issues. This administration, the Biden administration, in the last 10 months has issued 19 executive orders or executive actions solely focused on my state. 19. There's no other state in the country, not Maryland, not Oregon, no other state in the country that is getting this kind of attention from the new administration. And it's attention that we don't want, because almost every one of these executive orders and executive actions is hurting working families, is hurting our economy, is hurting access to our lands at a time when we're already hurting. I just want to ask my colleagues, respectfully, especially on the other side of the aisle, could you imagine a Republican administration coming in and saying, we're going to issue 19 executive orders and actions targeting Maryland or Delaware or Oregon or Massachusetts? Senators would be on the floor, rightfully, sticking up for their state and their fellow citizens. This is a challenging time right now. Working families are hurting with inflation, high energy costs. And we have an administration in the White House that thinks it's fine to target the great state of Alaska. Well, it's not fine. It's not fine. It's a war on working families in my state, and I would hope all of my colleagues would recognize that this isn't appropriate. This isn't appropriate. And it's not just these actions, Mr. President. The White House has made it known that it's gone to financial institutions throughout the country, banks, insurance companies, saying, don't invest in American energy projects in the Arctic, also known as Alaska. So I'm not going to hold this against Mr. Sams, Mr. President, my colleague from Oregon, I have a lot of respect for, but literally every major project that is resource development, employs people, helps working families. By the way, there's some that aren't economic. There's a law that we passed in the U.S. Senate 3 years ago to help Alaskan Native Vietnam veterans. It was my bill. I care deeply about these great warriors who were really screwed by their country when they came home from Vietnam. The administration has delayed the implementation of that bill for 2 years. There will be Vietnam veterans, Alaska Native Vietnam vets, in my state who will die before they get the benefit, because they just thought they could do another hit on Alaska. So, Mr. President, I ask my colleagues to just think about, put yourself in my state's position. None of you would accept that. And I'm going to start talking about it. And I'm going to start raising these issues, and I hope I can get some of my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, to maybe reach out to the White House going, hey, this really isn't appropriate. Alaska's had a rough time. Everybody's had a rough time in America, but really? 19 executive orders and actions? These are just the Alaska-specific ones. They're broader federal ones that impact us, too. But I want to work with Senator Wyden. I want to work with Mr. Sams, particularly on that issue I raised earlier. I think he's going to be very well qualified. I admire his desire to serve, his background, especially his Navy background. And I intend to lift my hold very soon, Mr. President, but right now I'm objecting. But my goal would be to have this nominee who's qualified, after further discussions with me and Senator Wyden, move to be confirmed by the United States Senate. But for now, I object.